I'm sorry to interrupt this awesome community discussion, but thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and to everybody who's watching online. My name is Kate McMahon. I'm the new executive director of the Castine Historical Society, and I'm really pleased that you all have come tonight to hear Dr. Hornsby's talk. I'll just do a brief introduction, and then he will take it away. Stephen J. Hornsby is Professor of Geography and Canadian Studies and former Director of the Canadian American Center at the University of Maine. A specialist in the historical geography of northeastern North America, he has published several prize-winning books, including the Historical Atlas of Maine. His latest book, Cod Coasts, Cultural Landscapes of the Cod Fishery from Cape Cod to Labrador, was published this year. Following the presentation, there will be a book sale if you're interested in purchasing a signed book. And you can see either me or Jules if you would like to purchase a book tonight. I'm sure Dr. Hornsby can also assist you. So please help me welcome Dr. Stephen Hornsby.
Well, thank you, Kate, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for turning out this evening to hear, I hope, an interesting talk. We'll see from the questions, perhaps. I'd like to begin by saying a few words about the cultural landscape, which may not be a term familiar to many of you. A cultural landscape is a natural landscape modified by human action. Humans have been creating cultural landscapes for thousands of years, and many of the most significant cultural landscapes that we recognize today have a historical dimension. I come from that old country, England, where the study of landscape has a long pedigree, going back to at least the 17th century. Second-hand bookshops in England have shelves groaning with books on local history and topography. Much of this local topographic writing about landscape has been and still is done by amateurs. But in the mid-20th century, the study of local history became professionalized. The academic leading this development was W.G. Hoskins, who founded the Department of English Local History at the University of Leicester in 1948. 7 years later, he published his masterpiece, The Making of the English Landscape, which one reviewer described as, quote, one of those rare books that can produce a permanent and delightful enlargement of consciousness. The book has gone through many editions and is still in print, 70 years after first appearing, an academic's dream. In the mid-1970s, the BBC commissioned Hoskins to produce 2 series of TV programs about the making of the English landscape. As you can see, W.G. Hoskins, and I'm quoting from the top here, Hoskins, quote, isn't just another retired history professor. He is a pioneer in seeing and writing about the landscape as a living record of our past. I clipped this article from the Radio Times in my second year as an undergraduate. And I know we have St. Andrews people here, so just a shout out there. But as a penniless student, I did not have access to a TV, and so I never watched the programs. The scripts, however, were later published as English Landscapes and One Man's England. They were among the few books I took with me when I flew to Vancouver in 1979 to begin graduate school at the University of British Columbia. The books directly influenced my writing of Cod Coasts all these years later. I use these books very much as the model in terms of the size, the number of pages, the approach, the mix of text, maps, and illustrations. Well, since Hoskins, the study of cultural landscapes has grown enormously. In 1991, UNESCO recognized the importance of cultural landscapes for World Heritage. To date, 121 cultural landscapes have received World Heritage designation. These landscapes include the English Lake District and Portugal's Douro Valley, famous for, of course, port wine. UNESCO has also designated hundreds of World Heritage Sites, including one created by the cod fishery. After studying the historical geography of northeastern North America for some 4 decades, I felt that the cultural landscapes of the cod fishery were sufficiently important that they warranted a book-length study. And here's one of these landscapes. This is Cheticamp on Cape Breton Island, which began with the French fishery in the 18th century. Of course, there is a large scholarly literature on the cod fishery, covering such topics as the ecology, economy, technology, and history of the fishery, but little writing, as far as I'm aware, that deals with the cultural landscape. In 1997, journalist Mark Kalansky published a popular book, Cod, a biography of the fish that changed the world, a book some of you may have read. Anyone read it here? Oh, okay. We've got real cod enthusiasts here in the audience. But he says little about the landscapes of the fishery. I felt it was time to take these landscapes seriously, as Hoskins had done for the English landscape, and argue that they have historical significance, not only in themselves, but also as part of the wider expansion of Europe overseas. The cod fishery was the first European activity in North America, and by North America I'm meaning the continental part of North America. Unlike the fur trade, and of course with Fort Pentagoet we've got a prime example of the French fur trade and the interaction with native peoples here in Castine. But unlike the fur trade, the cod fishery owed nothing to native people. The full brunt of European commercial enterprise was felt along the coasts of northeastern North America, from Cape Cod, the southern limit of cod, in the south to Labrador in the north. Well, the history of the cod fishery in North America is enormously complicated, far more complex than, say, a narrative of English settlement in New England. And you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, he's going to go through all of the complexities of the cod fishery. I'm going to keep it simple. As the Canadian political economist Harold Innis argued in his magisterial book on the cod fisheries published in 1940, the fishery was an international economy. Cod stocks were an open access resource. Anyone could fish for cod. After John Cabot, sailing for the English king, discovered these stocks in 1497, different European and then later North American powers competed for control. Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and then later Canadians and Americans have all played their role. European records of the fishery begin very early and show national claims to these waters. The Catino world map of circa 1502, and this is just a detail of a map of the known world to Europeans in 1500, shows the ragged edge of Newfoundland. So here's the British Isles, there's France, there's Spain, the Mediterranean, Greenland, Iceland. This is the east coast of Newfoundland. And then down here we have the Spanish discoveries, so Hispaniola, Cuba, and I think this is the southern tip of Florida here. But where we are, the eastern seaboard, is completely blank, unknown to Europeans. So already in 1502, Europeans had a good sense of the east coast of Newfoundland. And the flags and the text refer to land of the King of Portugal. So the Portuguese were claiming Newfoundland at that time. And then we have the Spanish possessions in the Caribbean. Capes such in Newfoundland, such as Cape St. Francis near St. John's, the capital of Newfoundland, appeared on European maps by the 1520s. Actually, Cape St. Francis is on the Catino map. It's of 1502. It's just not named, and it's not until the 1520s that it gets its name, Cape St. Francis. Cod was immensely important for the European economy. Dried cod, which we see on the left, a picture I took in Fogo, Newfoundland in 1982 before the cod moratorium and inshore fishermen with dried cod, Dried cod provided cheap protein, especially for the poor. France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy all imported huge amounts of dried cod. And cod is still part of the Mediterranean diet today. The picture on the right is of a restaurant sign in Seville in the south of Spain. Well, since these early contacts, the fishery went through two historical phases. It began with a seasonal outreach from Europe to the coasts of North America, an outreach that lasted in some parts of eastern Canada into the early 20th century, so more than 400 years. This fishery was then superseded by the rise of a resident fishery, in other words, a fishery resident here in North America. And that's what we are most familiar with here in New England, as we shall see in the case of Castine. To give you some sense of the larger context, I'm going to show you some slides of the remarkable cultural landscapes associated with the huge migratory fishery from Western Europe to northeastern North America. For several centuries, hundreds of ships and thousands of men, Europeans hardly know this, but the scholars have been into the records, and at least for the English fishery, just before the American Revolution, there were at least 10,000 men coming across each summer, so hundreds of ships. And then you think of the French and other powers also fishing in the earlier centuries. So it was a huge endeavor from essentially the British Isles, the coast of France, Spain, Portugal. So these ships with their men would come out every summer to fish for cod in New World waters, and then return with their dried catches in the fall to ports in Atlantic Europe. One such seasonal fishing site was at Ferryland, south of St. John's in Newfoundland. I was very keen to get the best photography one could get for this book. I wanted to give a sense of the larger landscapes. And Newfoundland is an enormous place and has these sort of sweeping landscapes with the wind blowing. And so I hired a wonderful drone photographer in St. John's, Newfoundland, to take specific views. And so this is a view just above a hill called the Gaze, and it captures the harbor at Ferryland. Well, if you look closely, we can see the archaeological excavation of the Avalon colony, which is here, and it's an ongoing excavation. And this was a failed 17th century English settlement. In fact, Lord Baltimore was behind it, and he came over, and the famous quote from Baltimore was that he saw the sad face of winter upon the land, and he knew that Newfoundland was not the place for an English settlement. And of course, he gets Maryland, and we have Baltimore named after him. He saw the light, as it were. But on the left-hand side, and if you go to Ferryland, you will never be told this. I mean, all the interest is on Baltimore's settlement here, and this is the visitor center here in the Avalon colony. But this is also very interesting, this peninsula jutting out, because this was the site of a fishing station belonging to Arthur Holdsworth, a merchant from Devon in southwest England. A remarkable property map from the early 19th century shows the various wharves and buildings associated with Holdsworth's fishing station. So this is the property map, essentially a deed map. The station was for sale, so this map was created. And there is the site there. There are a few remains, but nothing dating back to the 19th or indeed the late 18th century. But you can see the various wharves along here and buildings. And these are actually, you can just see some straight lines. These are actually fish flakes for drying cod on. Holdsworth brought out dozens of men from Devon to fish from Ferryland each summer. A portrait of Holdsworth on his estate in Dartmouth, Devon, in England, accompanied by one of his ship captains, and there's his ship captain, and he's pointing to one of Holdsworth's ships coming up the River Dart here. I suspect it's come from Spain or Portugal, and it's bringing wine up, But before that, it would have been in Newfoundland and taken fish to Iberian markets. And so it's now coming back to its home port. And so the captain is just reporting to Holdsworth here. Well, you can see this painting quite easily because it usually hangs in the room of 18th century English portraits in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Whenever I'm in Washington, I go to the National Gallery and always, make a pilgrimage to see this painting. I don't think the curators know how significant this painting is. It's one of the very few representations of an English merchant engaged in transatlantic trade, and is especially important for depicting a merchant involved in the Newfoundland fishery. Well, there's not much to see in Ferryland, but there is a wonderful site in Newfoundland and Labrador, which is the best surviving landscape associated with this early migratory fishery. And that is at Battle Harbour in southern Labrador. The small settlement is set in a harsh physical landscape of glaciated rock and freezing ocean. What are we in July? There's probably some icebergs around right now, but in winter, everything you would see right to the horizon would be frozen with pack ice. And the water, even in the height of summer, is just above freezing. So it's a pretty harsh place, but a wonderful base for prosecuting the cod fishery. You can only reach it as a visitor from the mainland by a 1.5-hour boat ride. This photograph is actually not being taken from the mainland. It's taken from another island. There's a sort of archipelago of islands, including Battle Harbour. An English merchant by the name of Slade from Poole, Dorset, also in southwest England, established the station in the late 18th century. Most probably, these are the oldest mercantile buildings still standing on the eastern seaboard of North America. It's really quite remarkable. In so many port towns along the US and Canadian seaboard, the waterfront's been redeveloped, but here there was no redevelopment, and the intense cold and the salt that was stored in these buildings, these are salt stores and dried fish stores, we think has helped preserve the timbers. And there's a better view. I think it's only a matter of time before Battle Harbour is designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site for its significance for the European fishery. Well, the English migratory fishery also reached into the Gulf of Maine. So just to show you, Battle Harbour is about here in Labrador, and Ferryland is about here, St. John's is here. And this map is showing the English shore, the sort of first area of English exploitation, the French fisheries around the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and then the English, in the early 1600s, push into the Gulf of Maine. Fishermen were attracted to the capes and offshore islands, such as Monhegan Island, Dameriscove Island, and Pemaquid, and the Isles of Shoals. But only scant archaeological remains have been found of this early seasonal settlement. The seasonal or migratory fishery from the southwest of England to the Gulf of Maine gave way in the 1630s and 1640s to a sedentary or resident fishery based in New England. So English colonization had started in the Boston-Salem area, and the settlers quickly realized that money could be made from fishing for cod around Cape Ann and Cape Cod. So this transition is enormously important because it represents the first shift in control over the fishery from Europe to North America, and had enormous long-term implications. The fishery provided at least some of the economic basis for the growth of colonial Massachusetts, and eventually, of course, Massachusetts' challenge to British imperial control in the 1760s and 1770s. Boston merchant John Roe recognized the importance of the fishery by giving a wooden model of the sacred cod to the House of Representatives in the Massachusetts State House. and I'm sure some of you will have seen it there. The great centre of this new colonial fishery was at Marblehead. The first area of the town to develop was at Little Harbour, shown here, which was used for inshore fishing craft operating along the coast of Cape Ann. So this is strictly inshore, within about 3 miles of the coast, small open boats along the coast of Cape Ann here. In the 1650s, the development of sugarcane cultivation in the West Indies and the use of enslaved people as labour prompted the development of the banks fishery, so the offshore deep-sea bank fishery. Slave owners needed a cheap protein to feed their slaves, and dried cod from New England provided that protein. Marblehead was at the forefront of the development of this new bank fishery, sending schooners out to the banks to fish for cod. So here now we've sort of got the reverse. Instead of English fishing boats coming into the Gulf of Maine, it's now colonial fishing schooners going out to George's Bank and the Nova Scotia banks, and even out to Newfoundland's Grand Bank to fish for cod. Marblehead grew rapidly. The town's core moved from Little Harbour. So if you know Marblehead, you know the oldest houses are in that Little Harbour area, and the cemetery, the town cemetery, is up on the hill behind, and that was actually the site of the first meeting house was there. And then as the town moved towards Great Harbour, which you see here, they opened a new meeting house closer to where people were living. And it was there that wealthy fish merchants such as Jeremiah Lee and Robert King Hooper built their grand mansions. So this is the Jeremiah Lee house, one of the most impressive colonial era townhouses anywhere. And then Hooper's house is here. And these are both open to the public. This is historic New England. To my mind, the remarkable colonial landscape of Marblehead should be designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The reason it's not, of course, is that the United States is, particularly now, is not very enthusiastic about the United Nations, and so there's very few UNESCO sites in the US. The obvious ones are the natural sites like the Grand Canyon and the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. But there are so many extraordinary sites, cultural landscapes and heritage sites in the US, which if they were anywhere else, up in Canada, for example, they would have been designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And certainly Marblehead, for its colonial landscape, it can't be matched anywhere else. It's just a remarkable collection of buildings. Well, Marblehead served as the model for the later development of the bank fishery in North America. So it really does start here. After the American Revolution, other ports in the Northeast rose to significance. In the 19th century, Castine, Maine, and Gloucester, Massachusetts, became the major centers of the bank fishery in the United States, while Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, emerged as the leading bank fishing port in Canada. And interestingly, Lunenburg is a designated UNESCO World Heritage Site. I'm not going to talk about Lunenburg, but the Canadians are, keen for tourism reasons to have sites designated, and Lunenburg is a sort of the 19th century equivalent of Marblehead. If Marblehead is late 17th and 18th centuries, Lunenburg takes the story into the late 19th century and early 20th century. Well, such has been the fame of Gloucester and its great fleet of bank fishing schooners that the role of Maine in the offshore bank fishery has been largely overlooked. But in the decades leading up to the Civil War, Maine, not Massachusetts, was the leading cod fishing state. Only after the end of the war and the rise of fresh and frozen fish markets did Massachusetts surpass Maine, and Gloucester become the unrivaled American bank fishing port. In the halcyon days of the Maine cod fishery, merchants in ports all along the coast, from Portland to Eastport, invested in the bank fishery, But it was in Castine, shown in this famous view, which I'm sure you all know, that emerged as the leading fishing port. From the mid-1830s to 1870, Castine merchants owned the largest fishing schooner tonnage in Maine. They also supplied fishing outfits, salt, gear, provisions to schooners from other ports in Penobscot Bay and Frenchman Bay. This famous picture, which I've got from the Castine Historical Society, showing a bank schooner there in the foreground, the Witherley Wharf and the sail loft, and in the background, a schooner loaded with lumber, perhaps for the West Indies market. So for more than 3 decades, Castine was Maine's preeminent fishing port. Following Marble's Head's lead in the colonial period, Castine merchants realized that they could sell poor quality dried fish to sugar plantations owners in the West Indies. A second and ultimately more important market developed in the southern United States, the subject of an excellent exhibition by the Castine Historical Society a few years ago. Castine merchants sold dried fish to cotton plantation owners needing to feed their burgeoning slave workforces. The principal market of New Orleans also had the added attraction of cotton as an outward freight. Cotton could be loaded in Maine vessels for shipment to Liverpool, England, gateway to the rapidly growing Lancashire cotton textile industry. For the return leg to Castine, rock salt from mines in Cheshire, very close to Liverpool, could be carried back for use in the fishery. In the bank fishery, massive amounts of salt were needed to preserve fish on board vessels for weeks at a time. So unlike the inshore fishery, where you caught the fish the same day, gutted, washed, and salted it, and laid it out to dry, in the banks fishery, vessels could be out for weeks, even months, fishing until they had a full hold, and therefore you had to preserve the fish before you brought it back to port, where it was then washed with the salt and then dried, and then it would be exported to the market. A final market existed in Boston for dried fish to feed immigrant Irish Catholics. Not only was dried cod a poor man's food, it also satisfied the Roman Catholic Church's edict to avoid eating red meat on Fridays and fast days. By the 1830s, Castine merchants were shipping dried cod to the Caribbean, New Orleans, and Boston. Castine also emerged as the leading port on Penobscot Bay, importing cargoes for distribution to settlers along the coast, particularly, in fact, salt. It was one of about 3 ports on the Maine coast that distributed salt. Its manufacturing sector included shipbuilding, a rope walk for the production of rope, rigging, and fishing lines, and a sailmaker. In the mid-decades of the 19th century, Castine was the center of a busy and prosperous maritime economy. The economic development of Castine as a bank fishing port and regional supply center led to the growth of the town. Although Castine's population was never large, no more than 1,400 people during its heyday, there was enough prosperity to create a distinct mercantile landscape. As I explained in a plate in the Historical Atlas of Maine, published a few years ago, mercantile towns in the state, and more broadly many other parts of North America, have a distinct pattern of land use, shown here. The allocation of land for particular uses was based on the market, what you could pay, just as it is today. So this leads to the sorting of the use of land. And the base of the triangle, as we're dealing with port towns, is, of course, the waterfront. This is the most expensive land, the point of connection to the maritime world, where you would find the wharves and warehouses of the merchants. And the merchants would want, of course, the deep water locations so they could bring in their deep sea trading ships to their wharves. And then behind the waterfront, you get these distinct bands. So financial services, such as banks, insurers, shipbrokers, retailing of goods that have been brought in by sea, perhaps hotel, entertainment, bars, taverns, depending on the size of the the town, and then at the apex, legal, political, religious, and administrative functions. So this would be churches, townhouses, and law courts, supported, of course, by tithes and taxation, and therefore, as Americans don't like to pay taxes, these services did not have the funds to have prime locations on the waterfront. So everything gets pushed back to the apex where land is cheap. That's where you find the services that we have around here. The counterexample to this is, of course, French New Orleans. I mean, if you think of Jackson Square, what is on Jackson Square, the old Place d'Armes, the French Place d'Armes? It's church, the French cathedral. Well, you simply would not find that in an Anglo-American port town, because the merchants would want that land, and no religious institution could pay the rent or to buy the land in such a prime location. So, in fact, the French ports are different to Anglo-American sort of mercantile capitalism. So, New Orleans with the church on Jackson Square is the sort of the antithetical example to what I'm talking about here. We've got, raw capitalism going on. Well, around the apex are usually found the homes of the merchant class who dominated the town's economy, society, and politics. If we look again at Battle Harbour, we can see this mercantile nucleus very clearly. This is another reason why I get so excited about Battle Harbour, because unlike the landscapes that Hoskins was studying, which have, there's thousands of years of human settlement in Europe, but if you're dealing with the cod fishery and you're not dealing with a native influence, which you are in the fur trade, I mean, the prime fur trading sites were often native sites, but in the cod fishery, this wasn't the case. So often the sites were way out on a peninsula or on an offshore island close to the fishing grounds. And so you get this very stark landscape where you've got no prior human settlement, and you've got mercantile capital coming in and slapping down a fishing station, and thankfully this one still survives. So it's sort of a pure example of European commercial capitalism. And so we can see in sort of embryo these various bands. We've got this wonderful collection of warehouses and wharves here. This building is the merchant store. So that's the retail band. There isn't a financial band because Battle Harbour is tiny. So all the financial is back in England. But we do have a retail store. This was the agent of the merchant of Slade. That was his house. The merchant didn't always come across the Atlantic. So that's the agent's house. So that's the apex, as it were. And this is the institutional building. I think this was the Newfoundland Rangers, the sort of police force. And this was, I think, the hospital for the Grenfell Mission. So those institutional buildings, again, pushed at the back. So you can see in a very stark and simplistic way how this mercantile triangle works at different scales. And this is the smallest that I know. And then you can just expand it and expand it. Think of port towns with groups of these along the waterfront and much deeper triangles and much larger institutional buildings. We show this in the Historical Atlas of Maine with a plate on Portland. So you can take it up to the size of Portland, indeed other larger towns like Boston and New York. But you can't find that landscape because it's been redeveloped many, many times. So we have it here in its original form. So what develops in Castine in the early 19th century is a more elaborate version of what we have here in Battle Harbour. Castine has one of the most perfectly preserved mercantile triangles on the entire Cod coast. And this is from the Historical Atlas of Maine, where we've got the model here, and then I slapped it down on an 1881 map of Castine. The failure of the town to industrialize after the Civil War, so there's no redevelopment happens, and the influx of wealthy summer vacationers combined to preserve the town's landscape. Apart from the addition of the Maine Maritime Academy in 1941, Castine is a relatively untouched mid-19th century port town. So if you look at my book, there are these sort of as you go through time, there are these sort of key examples. So you have, Battle Harbour for an earlier period, Marblehead, where we have elements of this. Castine is fantastic for the mid-19th century, and then Lunenburg, Nova Scotia for the late 19th, early 20th century. What I tried to do was establish a canon. What are the best examples? And Castine for the mid-19th century is superb. At the base of Castine's mercantile triangle is the waterfront. Despite the establishment of the Maine Maritime Academy dock on the site of an old shipyard and infilling between wharves through a parking lot, several of the old wharves and warehouses survive, which I'm sure are very familiar to you. So this is, I think, the old Witherley wharf and warehouse. Behind these wharves lie Water Street and a short commercial block that once housed the offices and stores of the town's leading fish merchants. So we have Witherley and Adams here, both involved in the bank cod fishery. The handsome two-story brick buildings are virtually unchanged today, although we now have a bank. But in the 19th century, Castine was too small to have a financial district of its own. The town's merchants relied on Portland and Boston banks and marine insurers. So again, it's just too small to support a sort of freestanding financial sector with only 1,400 people. However, a small retail district developed along Water Street and up part of Main Street. Running perpendicular to Water Street, Main Street served as the spine of the mercantile triangle. Near its intersection with Court Street, and I know we no longer have a court here, but the very name of Court Street suggests that there was when Castine was the shire town for Hancock County. It would have had the court here, hence Court Street. So that's that institutional apex. But even though we don't have the court, we have this wonderful institutional complex of the post office customs house, which you're all familiar with, the Congregational Church on Main Street, the townhouse on Court Street, the Unitarian Church here on Court Street just beside us, and also the town schoolhouse, which we're in right now on the corner of the Common. So these are all institutions which are not going to pay the top dollar rent for something on prime waterfront. They're all pushed to the back of the town. Well, around the Common and along Court and the upper part of Main Street are the town's grandest residences, which once belonged to merchants, ship captains, and rope manufacturers. No doubt influenced by the magnificent Federal and Greek Revival mansions built in Boston's Beacon Hill and in Portland's West End in the early 19th century, Castine merchants built their own more modest versions. I believe this is one of the Witherley houses here. In fact, those are both Witherley houses, I think. These fine houses, still shaded by elms, evoke the gracious living of their former mercantile owners. On the west side of the mercantile triangle, extensive cheap land provided space for the town's major industries of shipbuilding and rope manufacturing. So the shipyard is now where Maine Maritime Academy has its dock, and then where the Mariners play football is the site of the old rope walk here, as you can see. And this is just fields out here, so agriculture very close to the center of the town. In the late 19th century, the props supporting Castine's maritime economy were knocked away. The town suffered losses of men and ships during the Civil War. The building of railroads drained away seaborne commerce, and Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, captured much of the Caribbean dried fish market. So in a sense, for the next stage of the story, you've got to go over to Nova Scotia to see Lunenburg and to Gloucester. And Gloucester takes over really after the Civil War. Although Castine's merchants attempted to build a railroad to connect to landward markets, the scheme came to nothing. Instead, Castine, like other towns along the Maine coast, took advantage of summer tourism and reinvented itself as an exclusive resort. Today, Castine citizens take great pride in preserving the architecture and landscape of their town, one of the finest cultural landscapes along the entire Cod coast. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
I guess I have a question.
Sure.
In some of my reading, I recognize that this was very much, at least a neutral or even a loyalist town.
Yeah.
And to the extent that our merchants were seen as at least neutral or loyalist, they were able to keep their funding and banking facilities, credit lines of credit open, which financed shipbuilding that was not available to. Am I on the right track with that?
You might be. I don't know the details sufficiently on the mechanics of the sort of the merchant operations. I'm focusing much more on the landscape rather than the mercantile economy, which hasn't been looked at. So this is what I was trying to bring in. Yeah, but it's a great question. And I mean, this was a loyalist town, but then they all up sticks and moved around to St. Andrews, New Brunswick. So I don't know what happened after after 1783 here. I mean, Americans came in, but what their relationship was to British banks and insurers, I just don't know. It's a good question.
Our neighbors still think we're peculiar here, and my sense is that it has to do with that history.
Well, there's no question. I mean, Castine is historically one of the most fascinating towns on the Maine coast because of its long history. Yeah.
This past year, we visited Lunenburg,
Okay.
Scotia, and I'm wondering whether Lunenburg itself has really retained its landscape. I mean, you referred to it historically and so on, but we found it an incredibly interesting and charming place,
Yeah.
but didn't really explore very much in depth. So I just wonder if you could
Sure.
talk about it today and what controls there are there to keep it the way it is.
Well, Lunenburg is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It got its designation because it has a very regular town plan that the British laid out, I think, in the 1750s. But I don't think, as I actually say in the book, I don't think actually the town plan is the interesting part of Lunenburg. The fascinating part of Lunenburg is the bank fishery that really gets going in the late 19th century. And as you saw, it has an extraordinary sort of Victorian architectural heritage, all a bit later than what you see here in Castine. I mean, I think things stop in 1861 here. I mean, nothing really gets built after that until we get the main. I mean, there's a few shingle cottages, sure, with tourism. Yeah, but in Lunenburg, it's all a bit later, their boom period. And the other thing, and this is similar to Castine, is that in many of these old fishing ports in the mid-20th century, when you shift to freezing fish, big fish plants get put on the waterfront. And so the old warehouses and merchant stores just get demolished. I mean, the sad example of this is Gloucester, where they just, through urban renewal, just took out the old part, the waterfront of Gloucester. And there is a big fish plant as well in Gloucester. But here, I mean, the fishery was over, and so your waterfront is still extant, and you still got some of the old wharves here. In Lunenburg, there's far more of these finger piers or finger wharves, and the warehouses are there, and the merchant stores are there. And so I get incredibly excited about Lunenburg, as you can tell. So it's a kind of a bigger version and later version of Castine. And the bands that I talked about that you see here, you see beautifully also in Lunenburg. So it's an extraordinary model. You can take that triangle and, you know, I live in Belfast. It works perfectly in Belfast. I'm writing about Wiscasset right now. Well, it works perfectly in Wiscasset. So it's a very good model of urban land use. And I'm really glad that you've been to Lunenburg and raised it, because I encourage you all to go and see Lunenburg. It is the sort of crown jewel of the Nova Scotia sort of tourist landscapes, and it's very well preserved. Yeah.
I also have a question about Lunenburg.
Okay.
How do you account for them succeeding where Castine failed? Is it just because it was a bit later, or is it because they weren't dependent on, selling to states with chattel slavery, or a mix of factors?
I'm trying to find a picture of Lunenburg. Yeah, here we go. So there it is. So you can see, like, you've got one or two wharves and old merchant houses, whereas they've got all of this lot and the warehouses along here. This is the museum. I mean, obviously something's gone where they've got parking lots, but you've got to make compromises. Just as in Castine, you decided to fill in between wharves and create the parking lot down on the waterfront. So you've got to sort of accommodate the modern world, but you've got the very clear bands, and then you start to see all the churches, and there's the school up there. So the institutional buildings and the wealthy merchant houses are all up on the top of the hill. So it's kind of Castine on a bigger scale. The question was, how do they go about preserving it? I don't know what the legislation is. Whether they have stricter legislation in Canada to preserve the physical landscape, I just don't know.
I actually meant the cod fishery itself, like, historically speaking.
So what happened in Lunenburg is that they built the world's largest fish processing plant, but about a mile or so from the town at the entrance to the harbour. So they never redeveloped this lot. So that's why it all survives. Yeah, I mean, thankfully, I mean, if you're into historic preservation, thank goodness that, the modern fish plant was about a mile away, and this was all left. And this is now the Parks Canada Museum of the Fishery. So it's a great place.
I have a question. You say once the cod fishing was done, then fishing was over. But where does the sardine factories and the sardine fishery fit into that? Because up here, the coast, I don't know what was in Castine, but certainly up in closer to Canada and in Brunswick, there were sardine factories.
Yeah, Eastport.
And lots of people worked in them.
Eastport and Lubec.
Is that, when did that come? When did that start? Did it come?
It comes in with canning technology, which is sort of mid to late 19th century.
And we did have a sardine factory. We did
Yeah.
have a sardine factory here.
Yeah, there was a sardine factory here.
We have many sardine cans in the
It's a great question, but it's a totally different fishery. Any of you who know about fishing, I mean, you've got these different fish species and they have different ecologies and different geographies, and sardines are up in the Bay of Fundy and Passamaquoddy Bay, and so sardines and herring were used as bait in the cod fishery, but then sardines become a commercial product with canning.
So I'm kind of focused on the fishing rather than the landscape for a moment. But anyway, then you have Iceland and their fishing of herring. They had factories all around Iceland in many, many ports like this.
Yeah.
And that was all run out with the loss of the herring crop.
Right.
And I'm sure it's down here. And their fishing of Iceland was mostly the Portuguese.
Yes.
Even before it was settled in Britain.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the tragedy of the Canadian cod fishery is that they expanded at their 200-mile limit, like the United States did, And so they kept out all the foreign trawlers, and then they all piled into offshore fishing and scooped up all the fish. And by 1992, they were running out of cod, and they had to have the cod moratorium. And it hasn't been lifted yet. There's still fishing for domestic use, so you could go out in your boat and hand line for cod, but there isn't commercial fishing now in Newfoundland. So 500 years of basically a sustainable fishery got destroyed in just a few decades. I mean, it's tragic. And these settlements, well, the cover of the book is Trinity, and Ferryland and many other settlements suddenly lost their economic base. And so they turned to things like environmental tourism and cultural tourism. And that is, in a sense, what this book is aimed at, is the cultural heritage tourist market, to show visitors who go to Newfoundland, Labrador and Nova Scotia what the history of these places once was. Yeah.
So what was it about Castine that enabled it to become the center of the Maine cod fishing industry?
Good question. Access to the banks, a bit closer to the banks, deep water port. I mean, everything's going by sea, so forget any landward connections, they're not important. I mean, Castine is just one of several. I think Booth Bay was important, but I mean, Wayne O'Leary did the book on the Maine sea fisheries and crunched the numbers. And then when we did the Historical Atlas of Maine, I again went through the statistics, and because I didn't quite believe that Castine was that prominent, but I mean, the figures suggest that this was the case, that more cod schooners were owned here than any other port. And I wondered, that very question bothered me. I thought, well, why Castine?
Well, maybe the businessmen here saw the opportunity and just really went for it. They obviously saw the need and capitalized on it, whereas maybe other ports.
Those entrepreneurial
They missed the
Castinos.
boat. It's probably withered.
It's not just Witherley, though. I mean, there were other
Yeah.
cod merchants.
Yeah, but I mean, I think Witherley was like the leader, and I think, people were
Right.
following him and cashing in.
Yeah. And then, I mean, they're involved in the salt cod trade, and that just collapses around about the Civil War. And Gloucester moves into fresh fish and ice, and ice is the fish. The railroad goes into Gloucester. It's already in, I think, before the Civil War. And so they can get the fresh fish and frozen fish or semi-frozen fish to market pretty quickly. So they don't bother anymore with salting. And so, it's kind of over for Castine. And Lunenburg, being in Canada, has connections, I guess, down to the British West Indies and somewhat protected markets, I guess.
When did you say the salting kind of stopped? Is that?
Yeah, by the Civil War, I think that was the death knell here. And the reason Gloucester survived was that they had the railroad connection to urban markets, and they could also had ice there. In fact, there still is an ice manufacturer in Gloucester, and so they could ice the fresh fish and supply the fresh fish market rather than salted cod. So it was a change in technology.
More
Any
questions?
questions?
Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you.